Hey everybody, welcome back to the Rhinestone Podcast. My name is Banner Driscoll. I am the CEO and founder of Rhinestone Productions and host of the Rhinestone Podcast. At Rhinestone Productions, we have one goal, and that is to empower all musical creatives to make their best and most authentic music. And our podcast is an extension of that, where we interview the best musicians in the world and try to figure out their tips, tricks, and strategies took them from just someone practicing in their bedroom to a full-blown music career. And today's guest is somebody who's been doing this for a long time, and in my eyes is one of the best musicians I've ever talked to. This interview was so mind-blowing, and that guest today is Michael Manring. Now, if you guys don't know Michael Manring, I guarantee you've probably heard his music, especially if you're of my age and ever went to a dentist office. Michael Manring was the house bassist for the infamous Windham Hill Recordings label from the 80s and 90s. Kind of new age smooth jazz type stuff, but we talk about all the different sessions he used to do. He played with, of course, the fantastic acoustic guitar player Michael Hedges, but the thing that Michael's probably most known for is his incredible solo bass performances. So kind of, if you guys remember, we interviewed Andy McKee a couple weeks ago. Andy McKee does like the solo fingerstyle acoustic guitar stuff. Michael Manring does that solo bass performances, and he uses effects, gear, and all sorts of compositional techniques in some of the most interesting ways possible. And in this interview, man, we dive into all of it. And I mean, we dive deep. We start talking about gear. He gives me a lesson on Indian music and how to learn rhythms, which is unbelievable. We talk about scales and ragas. We talk about musicology from all these different parts of the world. We talk about these musicians that Michael loves. And honestly, it was just this was by far my favorite podcast I've recorded yet. Michael was just such a wealth of information, and it was funny because, you know, you could tell that Michael probably doesn't have too many people to talk to about a lot of this stuff, but man, we were ready for it. And it was so much fun, and it was so exciting to have someone to just dive into all this stuff with. And Michael is just such a great guest. He's an amazing artist who, even after, you know, almost 50 years playing the bass, is still like pushing the boundaries and is dedicated to his craft and just does such amazing work. This was my favorite podcast I've shot yet. I was on a high for about a week afterwards, and I'm still kind of reeling it all in, even though I've edited this and gone through everything. It's unbelievable. So this is a great podcast. You guys need to check this podcast out. Without further ado, guys, Michael Manring on the Rhinestone Podcast. Check it out. Welcome to the Rhinestone Podcast, where we uncover the stories behind the music industry's brightest talents. I'm your host, Banner Driscoll, and today we're diving into the extraordinary world of Michael Manring, a virtuoso bassist whose groundbreaking approach has captivated audiences worldwide. Regarded as the preeminent solo bassist of our time, Michael Manring has spent decades pushing the boundaries of what's possible on the bass guitar. Drawing inspiration from the legendary Jaco Pastorius, who also served as his teacher, Michael has forged a unique path, embraced unorthodox tunings, techniques, and methodologies. From prestigious venues like Carnegie Hall in New York to Yamaha Hall in Tokyo, Michael's bass has reverberated across the globe, leaving audiences spellbound. His collaborations span a diverse spectrum of genres, each partnership a testament to his versatility and innovation. His long-term collaboration and close friendship with the late acoustic guitar genius Michael Hedges led to a lengthy stint as the house bassist for Windham Hill Records, where his musical prowess shone on numerous recordings. As a solo artist, Michael has released acclaimed albums like Unusual Weather and Thonk, earning international recognition as a master of the fretless bass. His solo bass recordings Soliloquy and Small Moments further showcase his unparalleled creativity and musical depth. With 3 gold records, Grammy nominations, and awards from Bass Player magazine, his impact on the music world is undeniable. Join us as we delve into the remarkable career of Michael Manring, exploring his musical evolution, groundbreaking innovations, and the profound connection he forges with his listeners. Michael Manring, welcome to the Rhinestone Podcast. How are you doing, my friend?
I'm doing really good, Banner. Thank you so much for having
Absolutely,
me.
man.
And for that very kind intro.
Well, you know what? We only do the best for our guests. That's how we roll here. And so I'm so happy to have you here. You know, I like many people, you know, probably, I mean, gosh, it's probably 15 years ago now, but when those original Candy Rat Records videos came around, and of, you know, people like Andy McKee and Don Ross, you know, I never thought of solo bass as a thing, you know. And then to see your video of Celine was like one of those, just like, Oh wow, you can do that with the bass was
Awesome.
just epic. So I'm so happy to have you here.
Oh, thank you.
So Michael, there are so many directions we can go with a career like yours. There's so many different avenues and paths, and we can talk about this and that, and we're going to dive into a lot of stuff today. But I'm actually really curious about one person in particular in your musical journey, and I don't think I've ever heard you talk about this person, and I'm really curious. Um, who is Will Ackerman, and why is he important to your story?
Yeah, Will Ackerman is very important to me. I mean, he gave me my break in the music business. He was the founder of Windham Hill Records, which was one of the first successful independent record labels that did really well. Back in the 70s and 80s, the major record labels pretty much had a lock on almost all releases, and there were some independent labels, but they tended not to do that well. But Will started this label of his own called Windham Hill and had just really great success with it. He started, you know, kind of with moderate success, then just kept building and building. And he took an interest in my playing early on, and I became sort of the house bassist for Windham Hill, as you said in your intro. And he signed me to my own solo deal as well, and he did a bunch of records of my own for the label. And so he was the kind of first person in the music industry to kind of believe in me. And that was very important when I was just a skinny white kid living in New York and, you know, basically as your classic starving artist.
How did he find out about you?
I met Will because I'd been playing with Michael Hedges, and some of your listeners will probably be familiar with Michael Hedges. Just an amazing, super brilliant acoustic guitar player, really kind of redefined everything about the acoustic guitar. And I met him early on. I started playing with him when I was, I think, 19. We were playing together, and Michael went out to California to study at Stanford in the electronic music program there. And also he would play at night in the local bars to make some money. And Will came to one of his performances and just flipped out at hearing his, amazing stuff he was doing, and signed him to a record deal right there to Windham Hill. And when Michael went out to California to do his first record, he brought me along with him. And that's how I met everybody at Windham Hill, and just got involved in it from that point. It was 1981 when that happened.
So Windham Hill is a very interesting record label. It I saw a review of it. Someone saying that every dentist office from 1990 to 2005 had at least one Windham Hill record on there.
Yes.
I mean, and a lot of people, and I don't think this label is necessarily fair, but a lot of people assume it as like new age kind of, or but obviously there's all sorts of different artists. Obviously you have people like Michael Hedges and yourself who maybe put a little bit more artistic thought than other maybe new age style artists. But I'm very curious about what your session work was like at Windham Hill, and I how how do they I mean, I guess my question is like, how did it work? Were there charts? Were you guys cutting stuff live? Was it overdubs? Was there improvisation? Because it does kind of have a free flowing form to it a little bit. But what was different about like a Windham Hill session as opposed to other sessions you've done for other people?
Yeah, it was great for me. I absolutely loved it. I had come from a kind of a jazz background. I'd been doing a lot of bebop and fusion music with a lot of notes. And it was great to fall in. And I was kind of ready for something different. I kind of wanted to do something different. And so Windham Hill was really an incredibly lucky thing to fall into for me. When the New Age label got applied to it, the New Age moniker got applied to the record label, it was kind of a surprise to all of us, because the concept of New Age was already a thing. It was kind of associated with astrology and crystals. and near-death experiences and all this kind of stuff that most of us weren't really into. So it was kind of surprising that that is the name that stuck for it. The idea of the label originally was sort of to be sort of like an American version of the German record label ECM. We all loved ECM records, just still going, by the way, and wanted to do something kind of similar, but with a more American flavor to it, less kind of jazzy, a little less avant-garde, perhaps, maybe. And it really just somehow really connected with people, which was a surprise to all of us, I think. At that time, the music business had gotten very kind of focused on big time pop music. In, I think it was 1978 or 77, when Peter Frampton's live record came out, changed everything in the music business because they sold, I don't know, 13 million records, I think, in the first year or two. And nobody knew you could sell that many records, copies of a single record. And it kind of shifted the whole music business because somehow they make more money by selling a whole lot of copies of one record than they do selling a lot of copies of various records. And so they kind of, all the record labels got rid of their jazz subsidiaries, their anything kind of experimental, and just really focused on pop music. So there was kind of that hole in the music world just at that moment. And Windham Hill kind of fit that for people who, as you say, that dentist's office that didn't want to just play pop music, they want to have something kind of mellow to not stress people out. And so that was this little niche that we filled, and it was wonderful. In terms of how the music worked, the musicians were actually very different in terms of their methods of working and their kinds of backgrounds. We really shared this idea of wanting to make this kind of almost a pastoral sort of chamber music kind of sound. But people came from all different kinds of places and had different ways that they approached music. So the sessions were all quite different. We usually did things live. Occasionally, we would do them in layers, but always going into a studio to work. And generally, as live as possible was what we aimed for. Some of the people wrote charts, some didn't. Some of the musicians wanted to rehearse beforehand, but usually not. So most typically, the kind of thing that would happen is I would go into the studio and someone would play either the demo of the piece or a partially recorded version of the piece, and then we would start working. If it was tricky, if the piece was tricky, I would usually write myself a little chart for it. But if it seemed pretty straightforward, I wouldn't. Some people discouraged preparing of any kind beforehand. And some of the recordings actually, what's on the records is the first time I heard the piece. I'm just kind of guessing where it's going to go. So that kind of spontaneity was generally valued, but not always. With Michael Hedges, we would often work things out like in very, very minute detail and kind of everything in between. Yeah. So it was, I had done a lot of studying and working before that and had done a good bit of recording before that. So I was kind of prepared for whatever might happen. And so this was, for me, it was a lot of fun and was a pleasure to be involved in.
So there's a lot of things I'm curious about there. I mean, it Windham Hill has such a, you're talking about all these different, methodologies, but Windham Hill does have a sound to it. Like you can tell very quickly when you listen to a Windham Hill record that it's a Windham Hill record. What kind of things do you think create that auteurship of Windham Hill as opposed to, ECM or somewhere else? I mean, because it is a like it represents a time and a place for a lot of people. It does have a um it does have a, like, I don't wanna say nostalgia, but it's just like people listen to that stuff, and like I said, they think of dentist office and things like that, you know? I'm not trying to disparage the music, but I mean, that was the use for a lot of people. That's where a lot of people know that kinda sound from.
Yeah, it is interesting, isn't it? It was just something that we all kind of wanted to do. It just seemed like it was a good time for a music that was kind of kind of gentle and introspective, but still pretty sophisticated and kind of an alternative to a lot of the pop music that was going on at the time. And it was kind of amazing. Will was just able to find this group of musicians who all kind of shared this, at least some aspects of this vision, and and put it all together. Um, Yeah, it's kind of hard to say how that happened. It just seemed kind of like the right time for that. I can certainly talk about it from my own perspective. As I said, I, really grew up in kind of a jazz world and doing really, really complex music and music with a lot of chops. And in the early 80s, I was living in New York, and New York was really tough in those days. There was a ton of crime, and I had all kinds of trouble that I ran into. And after a couple of years of that, I was kind of ready to do something really different, to just play one note for a while and just focus on that. But I still wanted to bring the musical understanding that I had to the projects I was involved in. I didn't want to, not make music or make music that I didn't think was interesting. And so for me, it was really great. It was just what I needed at that moment. And I think for a lot of us, it kind of fit in this really interesting place in our art, the arc of our artistic lives.
So, how, being as technically proficient as you are, and kind of s I don't wanna say smooth, because that also I'm trying not to disparage the music. I'm really trying not to, but it has a smooth feeling to it. I don't wanna say smooth jazz, but
Mm.
it has a smooth feeling to it. Did you have to restrain yourself as far as, like, bringing all of that musicality? Was there ever any moments where, you were overplaying or underplaying, or how did you balance that out?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, for me, initially, it was a shock. It was a total shock because I was so used to this idea of if you're improvising, say, and there was a lot of improvising involved, there's a kind of set harmony that you're working with, and I had worked so much on all the interpolations you could put against that. So things that didn't necessarily go with that harmony, but would work if you uh, thought in kind of a way of extension of those harmonies. And with the Windham Hill thing, it wasn't about that at all. It was really just play a few notes. You really just want to focus on a few notes. So there'd be like a long solo for me, 30 seconds of soloing, but it wasn't about displaying chops. And it was, you really need to stick to this maybe 5 or 6 notes, but you need to try to make something interesting and make some music that tells a story in some way. And so it was totally different from what I had worked on so hard. But as I say, it was what I needed. I needed that at that moment. So it was a good challenge. And I didn't do terribly well, but it was something I learned how to do better as time went on.
So one of the things that is also interesting is not only were you one of the main session bass player at Windham Hill, but you ended up becoming your own band leader there, and you ended up having your own projects and in your own albums there. Um, how did that transition happen from session musician to recording artist, band leader?
It was pretty smooth for me. Windham Hill was really different from pretty much any other record company I can think of. They really did kind of foster a sense of family there. And if you released a record that didn't do so well, they didn't just drop you. They worked with you to try to see how you could do better. And they really tried to keep that sense of community going in the label, which was really wonderful. Just a great experience to have been involved in that. For me, I had I've always been a composer. In fact, if you twist my arm, I would say I'm more of a composer even than I am a bass player.
That's saying
But
something because you know.
well, thank you. I mean, I love both, and for me, the ultimate is to do both together. Um, but yeah, I'd always composed music, and that was always part of what I did. So when I started doing a lot of sessions for Windham Hill, Will knew that I was, that I was a composer as well, and said, "Hey, if you ever have music of your own, I would love to hear it." So I would send him little things that I was working on at the time, and then there was one project I was working on that I sent to him, and he just loved it and said, "Okay, we have to sign you as a solo artist as well as being our session bass guy."
And what was different about your sessions versus, say, Michael Hedges or Alex DeGrassi or any of the other people that were on the label? I mean, did you go in thinking like this is just another session, or was there more prep work on your end? What was it like to have your session happen there in that you because the thing is you're at that space already at Windham Hill as the session bass player, but to change, there's always dynamic shift within people
Yeah.
and whatnot. What was the difference between your session and being a session guy for somebody else?
It was a pretty big difference, actually. As I said, with some of the sessions at Windham Hill, they were really into being extemporaneous, and they really didn't want to do any kind of prep work beforehand and just really playing off the top of your head. For what I was doing, this music that I was making that Will really liked, I really could barely do it. I could barely pull it off. So it was hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of takes before I got it right. And even then, not really getting it right. I was working with an amazing producer, really just great artist who really helped me a lot, named Bob Reed. And we both were totally saw eye to eye in this. And so it would take months to to work on tunes. We'd maybe if we worked every day for 12 hours a day on one tune, we might get it mostly done in 2 weeks.
Oh my gosh.
But just, doing everything over and over because we knew exactly what we wanted, but it was kind of at the limit of our ability. And it was a kind of sound that, it wasn't like groundbreaking or anything, but it wasn't something that, we had done before. So we were really kind of trying to invent it as we went. And so, yeah, doing my own music was a little bit more painstaking than some of the projects on the label. But that's what I wanted. I wanted to really try to give my best. If I was going to put something out there for people to listen to, I wanted to feel like I had really done the very best I could with it. I value other ways of working as well and still work in lots of different ways as a session musician and enjoy it all. But in general, for my own music, I'd fuss over it and have a blast doing so. It may not sound like it to a lot of people, but I really enjoy that process.
Hey, y'all, at the Rhinestone Podcast, we are trying our best to get better and better and better guests. And one way that you can help us do that is by hitting that subscribe button down below. A lot of people who are checking out the podcast have not subscribed yet. And while we are not shaming you, we would really appreciate if you could take a second to subscribe. When we have these numbers up, it means we can get better and better guests. And when we get better and better guests, you guys have the chance to learn more and more about music and learn about the music game and the music industry and hear all these great stories and all these different things. As we're getting further and further and further along into the music world, I just want to get better and better people on so that you guys can keep learning and keep improving your game and get out there and take your music as far as you possibly can with all the information that we've presented in these episodes. If nothing else, I'm learning a ton, and that makes it worth it. But please subscribe. Hit that subscribe button. It means the world to me, and it will help us get better and better guests on. Well, you know what? That's a great segue because I'm actually very curious about your compositional process. I again, what you've been able to do with the bass as a solo instrument is just like mind blowing to me. Like I had no idea, and that was those kind of things were possible. And it's not only that they are possible, but you make them sound so good. I mean, it's just like when the way that like Jimmy Page bends a note and it hits you at your soul. When you hit the detuners on your, I mean, it's like, it's one of those things that feels so good. And so I'm really curious about your compositional process. Do you make demos? How do you collect musical ideas? How do you put them together? When is a piece of music done in your eyes? Like, I'm really curious about the compositional process. How does it work for you?
Well, thank you for those very nice words and for asking about this. I mean, this is my passion. Composing is my absolute passion. I'm getting to the point where, it's time to think about retiring, whatever that means. And all I can think of is, all I want to do is compose music, sit around and compose music. It's just what I've always loved more than anything else my whole life. And so the process is kind of odd. I don't have a method particularly to compose, but if I did, it would be to follow the process that the ideas seem to suggest. So it's about having musical ideas and then letting those go through whatever process they seem to need to go through until they're done. And when they're done, it's kind of hard to know. I just always seem to reach a point where I go, okay, yeah, that's done. Kind of mysterious, and I don't really ask too many questions about that. Sometimes I do, but not always. So yeah, it's the specific method for any piece of music. Most of the music I write, I really do fuss over a lot. I have an idea, and I'm going to take that idea and try every permutation of it, every different incarnation of it I can think of, and see which is the very best way to present it. My way of thinking about music, I think, may be a little different from what a lot of your listeners may be used to. It seems very natural to me, but I have come to realize over the years that maybe it's not quite the same for other people. I take a pretty long view of my place in the continuum of music. So I kind of like to see myself as, where I exist in this, as wide a lens of what music is as possible. So I try to use as many, I try to learn as much about music as possible from all over the world, from throughout history, and apply those ideas, techniques, inspirations as much as possible in the music I do. So it's a kind of a really trying to, to really stretch myself in the compositional process. So I'm using a lot of ideas that are kind of come from classical music. So a lot of what I write is thematic. So I'll have an idea, and certain ideas lend themselves to development. So if you have a musical idea, often it can be sometimes just a couple of notes, but not necessarily. There are lots of different ways that you can hear that set of notes working. You can, for instance, if you have 3 or 4 notes, you can take them and play them backwards, reverse the intervals. So you play that, you know, the inverse of what it is. You can transpose it. You can play it half as fast, twice as fast. You can use it as an accompaniment for itself in lots of different ways. All these kinds of things are possible in composing. And I love composing this way. I don't do this all the time. Some compositions are more just general ideas. So I'll just have sometimes like an effects patch will give me an idea of just a kind of sound I want to make, and I don't want to fuss over it too much. It's just kind of a general approach. These are all compositional approaches that have been used at various times throughout history, throughout cultures, and this is what I love to do. So there isn't really one specific method. It's more a matter of trying to find the right way of saying whatever it is I want to say at that moment. I hope that makes sense.
Well, there's a lot there, man. I definitely want to unpack some of those things. So, what kind of ideas can you maybe give me an example of this where you've taken some ideas from different cultures of the world and different methodologies and applied them to a composition. Can you give me an example of that in your own music?
Absolutely. So there's a piece on my latest record. The record is called Small Moments, and the piece is called There Is Nothing the Wind Cannot Blow Away, which is a phrase from a book I read in Stories from the Small Landlocked Country of Burkina Faso in West Africa. And I love the music from Burkina Faso. And I've been really lucky in that I've been able to play with some really great musicians from that country. And anytime I get to play with people like that, I ask them a lot of questions about their music and their approach and how things work. And I try to apply some of the ideas I learned from them in that music. But at the same time, I'm not trying to play folk music from Burkina Faso. I'm using it all in the context of other things that I understand. So at the same time, I used some phrasing in the melody for that piece that I learned from South Indian music. There's a way of moving rhythms across the frame of reference that's used in South Indian music, and I used that in the melody. And then I used a lot of electronics too, which is kind of coming from a different place entirely. So this is what I like to do, just kind of use these different ideas that I love and try to put them together in different ways, because this is a reflection of who I am, right? I love all this music, and trying to put it all together is for me, that's what I enjoy. It's a way of really being honest to myself.
And so what was that country you said that that where you stole the idea from? What's that country called?
It's called Burkina Faso. It's 2 words.
Burkina
Burkina.
Faso.
Yeah, first word is Burkina.
Okay.
The second word is Faso, Burkina Faso.
So I have to ask, how did you find out about them and their music? And I mean, how did that's such an esoteric thing. You must be one of 5 people on Earth, and or at least in America, who know about this. How did you find out about this kind of music?
Um, so I'm a really boring person. I have very few hobbies, and I just love music, and I have really spent my whole life learning as much about music as I could. And when I was a kid, I would go to the library, and they had records there, and you could check out the records. And I would check out any record I could, any record of music I could. If it was something I didn't know already, I would listen to it. And I became really fascinated with African music from Africa. Now, Africa is a continent, so it's a huge variation of music all over the continent. And it's kind of crazy to talk about African music, but there are certain kind of continuities that do make sense. And from that, I just got interested in studying the various aspects of the music. I've always worked with a lot of different musicians as well, and every time I meet new musicians, I try to find out what they're interested in and learn from them. And a lot of my musician friends were interested in African music as well, and so we would share recordings and share ideas. And I always did as much reading as I could. And yeah, I have a number of friends who are crazy fans for the music of Burkina Faso. One I should probably mention is my good buddy, Lucas Ligeti, who's an amazing, amazing musician. He is the son of really one of the greatest composers of the 20th century, Georges Ligeti, who your listeners will probably know his father's music, Georges Ligeti's music, because Stanley Kubrick used it in most of his movies. In 2001, there's that really spooky sounding vocal music. That's Georges Ligeti's music. Atmospheres is the piece that Kubrick used for that. And he used, there's several other pieces of Ligeti's music he used. So Georges Ligeti was, relatively well known for a 20th century composer. And right, Lucas is his son, and Lucas is a drummer. And comes from that kind of European classical music background, but also is interested in all kinds of other music too. And so we hit it off, big time. And he's kind of an expert in the music of Burkina Faso. he, I think he still goes every year to the country, and he put together a group of musicians from Burkina Faso with himself called Burkina Electric to explore the kind of meeting point between contemporary electronic composition. By that, I don't mean dance music, but kind of European, uh, uh, kind of intellectual
Yeah.
music, and the traditional music of Burkina Faso. So I learned a lot from him, and also from a lot of the musicians that he's worked with, but a lot of other musicians from Burkina Faso as well. All the countries in Africa, probably is better to say all the groups of people in Africa, have their own kind of different versions of how they think about music, and they're all really, really interesting. They've been playing music for a long time there and have done really interesting things. Does that make sense?
No, that's awesome. I love how in depth you've gone on your study of Burkina Faso. I mean, that's really cool that you've like found people who've obsessed over that and then implemented that in your own music, and that it's just a good reminder, especially for us in the West here, that like music is worldwide, and there's more to the world than the top 40 radio.
I mean, it's so thrilling to be alive now and to have access to all this music, and more access as time goes on. As I said, for me, it was great to be able to go to the library and be able to check out, African music record, but also maybe a record of folk music from Bulgaria, and as well as lots of music from the European tradition, and learn about all that. But now it's even easier, right? You can just, go online and instantly, look up all this amazing music and get all this information about it as well. So for me, it's just been thrilling and just irresistible to try to find, this is really, maybe not the first generation for whom this has been possible, but, certainly one of the first generations of musicians where you really have the possibility of exploring musical ideas from, throughout the world, throughout time, and just trying to dip your toe into this idea of how to make sense of it all. Because that's what's happening in the world, right? We don't really have Western culture and Eastern culture anymore. There's not a separate European culture. It's all just kind of one culture now. And so we have to kind of try to make sense of that. And being an artist, for me, that's just a thrill to try to do my little part of how we can piece this all together. And, I'm not, I don't, I'm sure I'm making a ton of mistakes and doing things that would probably regret in time, but just the opportunity for me is what's most thrilling.
At what point does gear become a part of your compositional process? Because one of the things I absolutely love about you is you do use a lot of wild gear. You have the hyper bass, which is one of the wild. People, we'll throw a picture up here on the podcast, but I mean, it's one of the wildest bass. It's 3 octaves. It has a huge cutout. It's got, hip shots, detuners, everything. And you use gear and effects in very musical ways. Um, and I'm just curious, at what point does gear become a part of the compositional process for you?
That's such a great question, Banner. And I really appreciate you asking it. It is kind of interesting. So as you can tell, I spent a lot of time just thinking about music and processing musical ideas. And and this is an interesting one. Technology and music are always linked, right? As soon as, maybe not when people sang, but as soon as somebody hollowed out a log and hit it with a stick and went, "Oh, that sounds cool." That at one point was the height of technology in the world, and they made music with it right away. There was a considerable bit of time when the most complex machine in the world was a musical instrument. The church organs in Europe, in I think it was the 17th century, maybe 16th century, that was the most complex machine that existed in the world. So this idea of technology and music, they've always been really tightly linked. And our technology has enabled us to explore our innate musicality. This is what's really fascinating. Everything that we've found technologically, whether it was, that first hollowed out log or the latest, synthetic oscillator that somebody's coming up with in a lab, what these things do is they unlock in us what's in us already, our innate ability to make music. These things aren't really kind of inventions as much as they're discoveries. So this is an idea that really fascinates me. And obviously we live at a time when we're at this technological kind of jump forward, right? Like the Industrial Revolution was one of those, and obviously we're in another one with kind of this digital revolution. And so again, as an artist, this is really thrilling because it's a chance to try to make sense of what all this means and how we're going to process these. With each technological step we make, we have to figure out how we're going to deal with it. When you think when the first people, you know, discovered fire, that must have been a shock. It was really dangerous. Because you could just as easily burn down your whole habitat as you could make the food you were eating safe to eat. And it's kind of been that process all along. These technologies are always risky. Sometimes they cause us as much trouble as they help us. But music is a place where we can kind of work through those equations. And so for me, it's irresistible. The instrument I play is both electric and acoustic, in that the sound is made acoustically, but it's immediately captured electronically and can be processed electronically. So to me, it kind of represents this sense of old technology and new technology really married, really put together. And that allows me to explore these ideas of where this technology can go. So it's always been something I wanted to do, and it's something that's always, it's one other tool in the toolkit. So I can play in 12 different keys, or more keys if you want to get technical about it. And having the electronics is just like other keys you can play in. It's other tools that you can bring in to do this. And so that's always the process for me. The trick is not to let the technology dictate the process. I'm never happy if I feel like I've just let the machine or the technological device determine what I was going to do. But at the same time, there is kind of a dialogue with it. I'm looking at what options the technology makes available, and then I'm trying to think about how I can use that to say something I want to say. I hope that makes sense.
So how do you know when you've gone too far, when the gear is dictating the music? I mean, are there boundaries in your head? I mean, because your music gets pretty technical from a bass level, and it also gets very creative from the gear level. Um, and yet you tread that fine line where you're not showing off, but you are serving the music. I mean, how do you reel yourself in from turning it into a show off bass competition, or a look what cool gear I have competition?
I mean, that's such a great question, Banner. I hate to answer it because any answer I give is going to be worse than the question by far, but I'll do my best. It's the question is the main thing. That's what I have to ask myself all the time. Okay, am I just letting the gear take over here, or am I using it as part of the creative process? And it has happened a couple of times. This happened with me for looping, actually. I was really lucky in that sort of the first commercial looper that was available was made by the Lexicon Company, and I was working with them at the time, and so I got one of the first ones. And I was absolutely thrilled. For the people who don't know, a looper is a device that's made so you play a phrase of music into it, and you step on a button, and it plays that phrase back over and over, and then you can build on that in lots of interesting ways. And I was really thrilled by this and really jumped in with both feet right away. But after a couple of years, I felt like I wasn't really doing anything else with it. I I just felt like I wasn't really I was kind of letting it do what it wanted to do and not really I wasn't able to push it further. Now there are a number of people who work with loopers who are way more creative than I am and do amazing things. But for me, I kind of had to let it go. So now I very rarely use loopers anymore. Sometimes I do, but much less than I did initially. So yeah, it does happen. And how do you know when it happens? Yeah, you know, one thing about being an artist is that it's continually this process of trying to be honest with yourself. It's continually asking yourself, is this really am I really doing this because it's something I believe in, or am I doing this just to satisfy my own ego? Or am I doing this because I want somebody to think I'm cool? And even if the answer to those last two questions is yes, that doesn't mean it's off the table. It just means that I have to take that into consideration. So yeah, it's a matter of just asking these questions and trying to guess when I've crossed a line that I don't want to cross.
I love that because, like I said, your music is not only technically amazing as I'm barely a bass player. I'm mostly a guitar player, but I've played bass in a few bands, and I can slap a little bit. But your music is so technically interesting. It's gear interesting, but at the same time, it's like someone who doesn't understand bass guitar can hear your music and be like, "Oh, that's moving. That's really cool." And that's why some of your stuff has millions of views on YouTube. Because it is very moving stuff. And
Oh,
so the
thank
the
you. I'm
fact
so glad.
there's some of us out here, man. We're rooting for you. We're rooting for you. But no, I love that line. I love that you tug on that line and you write it, and it's why I think you're as interesting to me as credible as you are. I think it's just because you do ride that line really well.
Thank you so much.
So my next question to you is, how in your playing, at what point do practice and composition, where are they separated and where do they overlap? Because you are technically gifted, and you are, like you said, you're married to the composition. You're married, you said you love, you said earlier that you love composition more than you love being a bass player, being a composer more than you love being a bass player. So I know as a songwriter and as a composer that the lines could get blurry very quickly. Do you have separate times for each? At what point does a little lick or a motif turn into, all right, we got to work on this, or oh, I got to practice this slap thing, or this? I mean, when does practice? What are the defining lines for you for each of those? I guess, and do they overlap at all?
These are such great questions, Ben. I mean, I do kind of hate to answer them because I'll never come up with an answer that's as good as that question.
That's not true. You're doing great.
It's
You're doing great.
it's because the question is really the answer. The question is that's what you do. And yeah, it's a really interesting thing, right? I'm sure you've had this experience of, you'll be practicing and working on something, and then you'll play something, and it could be just a couple of notes. It could be just one note. It could be just one note. And you go, whoa. And that will send you off where you become a composer then instead of a player. And why that happens, I guess that's what we call inspiration. I guess maybe it activates the imagination and I very rarely found myself interested in asking why it happens because I'm so fascinated in following that lead, following that spark, and just going as far down that process as I can. I'm a pretty I try to be pretty disciplined in my practice. There are very specific things I want to be able to accomplish in music. A lot of things I can't do that I would like to be able to do. And so I try to be really focused and spend my time wisely in practice. But you're absolutely right. There'll be those moments when something happens. And usually what I'll do is try to record those in some way, either record them audio or write them down, anything that needs to be done, and then go back and revisit that when I have time. But I try to keep my practice time pretty sacred or pretty isolated from the rest of my life and pretty focused. And then after I've practiced a certain amount in a day, then I feel like I can work on these other ideas. But it's mostly a matter of collecting them. But it does happen all the time where I'll be in the middle working on something and just get an idea, and then I'm gone for the rest of the day. I don't get any more work done, really.
Yep, been there, done that. It'll get you real fast. Okay, so I'm curious about your practicing. What are you practicing these days?
Right. What I spend most of my time on is practicing tonality, practicing in various tonalities. I think this is the hardest thing to master in music. What this means is, um, if, how can we say, I don't want to get too far out there, but so what basically this means is choosing a scale and trying to be good at playing any possible pattern I can think of in that scale. Right. Maybe I should leave it at that.
No. Go further. This is a podcast. We want to dive deep. What does that mean? Because that sounds just like boring scale work. Is that what that is?
Right. So a lot of it is. So one of the most interesting things about music is this idea of tonality. Tonality is a very, very weird thing, and I don't think we really realize as musicians or as people who are musicologists or even people who study psychology of music and music cognition really quite understand how weird tonality is. What I mean by tonality is that we are all constantly scanning our audio world. And what we're looking for all the time, this is completely unconscious, we can't help it. There's only a very small percentage of people who can't do this and who don't do it. It's like way less than 1% of people who have what's called amusia. They don't have the ability to do this, but everybody else does. We're trying to find notes, like what we would call musical notes. And if we find those, we instantly put them in this hierarchy. We find this one note that acts as the tonal center, and then the notes around it have this very, very particular kind of emotional resonances to us. They have physical resonances as well, but those notes have certain meanings to us. And that's what tonality is. And as far as we can tell, no other species does that. When we think of all the amazing musical species in the world, birds and whales and all kinds of animals that do amazing songs, they don't seem to have any preference for this kind of tonal hierarchy that we have. And we all do it in exactly the same way. That's what's really weird. It's all, as far as we can tell, throughout history, in every culture, we all organize music in this same way. We hear it with this tonal center and then this set of notes around it, basically 12 notes that can react around that. That's just the way we're built. Nobody seems to know exactly why we do that. There's some interesting theories. But this is a fascinating thing. And so understanding these tonalities and how they work within us, how they move within our bodies and within our psychology is a really fascinating thing. And so this is what I really enjoy doing. It's also very hard to master. It's not really that hard to understand. You can understand everything about tonalities by studying for, I don't know, a year or two. But then to master it is really, really difficult. I'm not sure anybody's ever really done it. Maybe, but this is what I enjoy spending time on. It's also what I kind of need to spend time on, because if somebody hires me to play on their music, I want to be able, most of the music that I end up playing on is tonal. And if it isn't, then I'm still applying the same process because there's certain things you have to do to keep music from being tonal. And so I have to be able to play certain notes in certain ways at certain times. And so that ends up being the kind of biggest challenge in music. There are other things too. I should mention rhythm. I do spend an awful lot of time on rhythm, which ends up being quite challenging as well. But that's the bulk of it, is kind of working with these tonalities and then putting them in rhythms and trying to get, be able to play the notes, the right sound, the right time, the right place, the right expression. That's the challenge. Does that make sense?
I think so. I think I've understand it. So as far as like a practical practice session, what does that look like? Because I mean, you obviously got this great big philosophical understudy of what tonality is, but like, when you pick up a bass or you're at a piano, what does that look like?
Right. So for me, the first thing is what we would call warming up. Um, I, I'd like a better term than that, but that's what we use. The first thing I do is stretching, and I can't play unless I've done this. I don't recommend to any of my students, I don't recommend that they play without warming up too. So it's doing some stretching. If I have an hour to play, this would maybe 5 minutes. And then I pick up the bass and do some very, very simple focused things. And this is not thinking about tonality. This is thinking about the body mechanics and how that relates to the structure of the instrument. So this is just playing one note with my first finger and trying to play it well, good tone in the right moment I want it to be played, with the right dynamic and all that. This is another 10 minutes or so I spend doing these very focused exercises, running through all the permutations of what's possible with fingering on the instrument, so that I've just, this is pretty standard stuff of doing anything physical where you do all the options that are available to just get your body in the right perspective to do whatever it is you're going to do, running your joints through the full range of motion, that kind of concept. And then I start working. Usually at that point, I'll work on something tonal but not rhythmic. So at this point in my life, I'll often pick, say, usually a little bit more exotic tonality. I don't really feel the need to work with some of the more standard tonalities because I've just spent so much massive amounts of time on them already. So I'll pick a tonality like, let's say, Maya Malavagala, which is a South Indian raga.
Okay,
And I'll
wait,
just work
hold on. So what is that? Okay, because I thought you were gonna be like, I'm tired of playing the key of E, and then you start throwing some wild stuff out there. Let's backpedal a bit. What is that?
Yeah. So Maya Malavagala is a South Indian raga, and it's a really interesting raga. It's not a sound that we have so much in Western music, but we should because it's really cool. And what it is, I can sing it for you.
Please do.
It's sa ri ga ma pa da ni sa ni da pa ma ga ri sa. So it's a root, minor ninth, major third, perfect fourth, perfect fifth, minor sixth, major seventh, and then the root again. That's Maya Malavagala. And just a really interesting tonality. It's the tonality that's most used for practicing in South Indian music. In the North, actually, they use the major scale. That actually is the tonality they work on the most. But in the South, it's a big one they use. And so I work on something like that and try to do all the different patterns. I play all the triads in that tonality, play all the triads in every inversion in that tonality, and just try to really be good at it. But I'm also trying to, if I'm playing the fretless, I'm also working really hard on intonation. Intonation is actually a really, really complex thing. I mean, on one level, it's simple. You just try to play in tune, and if the tuner says it's in tune, then you're done. But on another level, it gets really, really complex, and this is something I work with a lot. So if I'm working on Maya Malavagala in the fretless, I'll also be working a whole lot on the intonation and trying to get exactly the right intonation for each each tone in the context of that tonality. So yeah, that's where I'll start. And then as it's pretty boring, as you say, and pretty intense. I'm kind of applying every bit of intellectual and physical energy I have to the process. So as this goes on, I tend to loosen up and do more improvising and less exercise, and add rhythm in and try to do more rhythm work. So that's very typical kind of thing I do. Some days I'll just focus on rhythm for a while, and as the practice session goes on, I'll try to be more and more fun and kind of a little less, just really zoning in on one note for 30 seconds. And um, often there's music I need to work on, so I'll usually put that kind of later in the practice session as well. But that's most typically how things go for me. Hopefully that makes sense.
No, this is amazing. I love this. Okay, so I do have a follow-up question, which
Mm.
is, all right. I mean, okay, so I'm gonna play ignorant American here. All right, where do you learn all this stuff about like Indian music, like for a Westerner? How I mean, like I've listened to Ravi Shankar and Omar. No, what's his name? The tabla guy, the really good. I forget his name. His name's blanking on me, but he's a great tabla player. Uh,
Zakir Hussain, probably.
Zakir Hussain, thank you. I've
Yeah.
seen him in concert, phenomenal, and that was really, it's like if I saw Earth, Wind and Fire a couple years ago, and you know I've been playing music now for a couple decades, and I know how Earth, Wind and Fire works. Do you know what I mean? Like I know what key
Yeah.
they're in. I know the tonalities. I know the tones.
Yeah.
I know,
Exactly.
and it's great. I love it. But I know how it works. When I saw Zakir Hussain, I was just like, "What? I don't know what is going on here. I'm so confused." Where does one learn about these scales? And is there resources for Westerners that are easy to find for this kind of stuff?
Yeah, it used to be quite difficult. As a kid, I was just interested in the sound and wanted to learn as much as I could, and would go to the library. Basically, was the place I went. And there were books about Indian music, but they were really unhelpful. And it's kind of not the way you learn about Indian music. I've still got some Indian music books that are interesting, but there's like, yeah, this is not really how you think about Indian music. Um, but things have changed so much. I mean, you can hear lectures by master musicians. Just go on YouTube and find amazing things and people explaining all this stuff. I've been lucky enough to play. I've played with Zakir actually, and as much as he would allow me, I pestered him with 1,000 questions about how this works and how that works, um, and super nice guys, totally happy to sit there and show me on his tabla how his dad was a great tabla player too. His dad was Ravi Shankar's tabla player, and show me how this is the rhythm as he got it, and then he changed it this way, and then and so on. So this is my passion. I just really am interested in all this stuff, and want to be able to understand as much as possible and use it to try to make sense of life. That's what it is for me. I'm a pretty obnoxious person overall. Not only am I really boring, but I am always having an existential crisis, and have since I was like 9 years old. But music is a way for me to process that. So whenever I learn something about music, it's like, oh, okay, so this is, music is, it's not, doesn't just exist kind of randomly. It's always about life. It's always telling you something about life. So I'm trying to figure out, what is this element of musical idea tell me about life, and how can I make sense of that? But yeah, it's amazing. Now you can just go, YouTube is an amazing teacher. I mean, and there's just incredible stuff out there. You can learn all kinds of stuff. In some ways, maybe even better than having a teacher in some ways, because you can go to a lot of different teachers and see what they're doing. I wouldn't recommend that. The way to really to learn Indian music is you sit down with a teacher, and that's your guru. Um, but you don't have to do that, especially if you don't want to play Indian music. If you just want to learn about it, then there's just so much information out there. now, and I wouldn't recommend doing that unless it's something that interests you. There's no particular reason to do it unless you're you're interested in it. Um, and there's a lot of things I'm not interested in that I don't know anything about. I know almost nothing about sports, for instance. So yeah, it's just having the passion and just feeling incredibly lucky to live at this time when I can get a lot of my questions answered so that I can generate a whole bunch more.
So obviously there is YouTube, but is there a good place to start, especially like to learn like the scales and things like that? Do you have any places where you think people should start with that stuff?
If you wanted to learn about Indian music, um, there's a great podcast for about South Indian music where you can really learn a lot. They have, I think they went up to something like 70 episodes, kind of a lot, but they do kind of walk you through it. It's called Raga Rasika. Rasika means like a
How
workshop.
do you spell that?
It's all one word, and they spell it. Um, there's hundreds of different languages in the Indian subcontinent, and so there's a million different spellings of everything when you put it into English. But their spelling is Raaga, so that spelling of
Okay.
raga, and then the last half of the word is rasika, Rasika,
Okay.
and it's a great resource if you want to understand South Indian music. It may be more than you want. But if you want to get into it, you can just listen to the bunch of those podcasts, and they really kind of walk you through what it is. There are other ones as well, um, but it kind of depends on. A lot of this depends on how participatory you want it to be. Um, Most of the stuff that's out there is really quite participatory, which is great. So they'll walk you through the exercises you do to learn about Indian
Hey,
music.
we're
But
all for
it's
going in depth here at Rhinestone, man. Let's hear it.
yeah. Well, there's a lot of, just Indian music lessons like that online, and they're great, both North Indian and South Indian. There's basically two forms of quote classical music in India. North Indian, which is called Hindustani, and South Indian, which is called Carnatic. They're both really interesting. There's a lot of overlap, but they're not the same. And yeah, those are great resources. There's probably somebody probably has a kind of an introductory lecture someplace that you can just kind of get an introduction as opposed to kind of jumping in to the full business. But if you're a musician, I really recommend it. It's kind of interesting the way music has worked in history. I don't want to go. I don't want to bore you too much with all this
No,
stuff.
no, bore
Um,
us, go deep.
so one way of thinking about music is, well, let me start here. Music has been part of every culture we've ever found throughout history. So you dig up a old site and you find people used to live there. They had music. Everybody had music, and it's incredibly central to who we are. We kind of forget that. Possibly, it seems to me maybe even more central to who we are than language. We kind of think of language as what really makes us human. Maybe music even more. So it's really, really central. It's really powerful in our lives. When we think about what that means, music has always done a few different things, and there's a lot of overlap between these. But we could say there's always been folk music. People have always used music to make the kind of drudgery of life easier. So they've always had songs to sing while you're cooking or, you know, hunting or whatever it is, or just walking. Um, there are songs that you share with people to tell stories. Everybody everywhere has always done that. Everybody everywhere has also done spiritual music. Music has always been part of everybody's spiritual experience, whatever that is. It's kind of interesting, actually. We've never found any culture that didn't have music as part of their spiritual experience, whatever that is. There's this other way of thinking about music. Again, there's a lot of overlap between these that I usually refer to as aesthetic music. So what this means is when you have a group of people who are professional musicians, almost always associated with a court. So royalty, princes, kings, where they'll get a group of musicians and they'll say, okay, I just want you to spend all your time on music, really study it, really master it, really, and then give me, the fruits of your labor. I just want you to totally go deep into music and and really make an art form out of it in that way. Hard to know what to call that music. We usually call that classical music, but that's not really the greatest term. So I use this term aesthetic music for that. And a lot of cultures have had this. Not everybody, because not everybody can afford to have that kind of situation. But that happened a lot in Asia. China, there was a lot of this kind of music. In Japan, there was a lot of this kind of music. In Java, in Indonesia. But the two kind of big ones were in Europe and in India. They were really kind of successful in this process of taking music and really trying to understand it, really trying to work with it. And there's these two kind of systems, and these are kind of the ones that have kind of the most useful in a way, I guess. I hate to say that because the Japanese version is really cool, the Chinese version is really cool. A lot of these aesthetic musics are really cool, but the European and the Indian are just really powerful. They found lots of interesting things. And so I kind of recommend anybody who's really serious about music kind of go into that Indian place a little bit and learn about what they did. Because it's a little different from how we did things in the West, but totally applicable, totally, totally stuff we can use. So right, does that make sense?
No, this is amazing. I love this. This is fascinating.
So right, so that's kind of where that is. So it's there's only kind of so much you can study folk music. Like if you want to learn the blues, it doesn't really make sense to go sit in a classroom so much. It really, the way you learn the blues is somebody says, well, you play this, you play it this way, and you play it for them, and they say, no, that's not right, you play it like this. And then they say, that's it, you've played the blues. And that's kind of all there is to it. The same is true if you want to learn wawanko or, a million other different kinds of music in the world. But with these aesthetic musics, it's a little bit more you can kind of sit in a classroom and learn how they work. And they tell us these things about music. Is that the whole story? Probably not. There's other stuff too. The interesting thing is there's also the scientific approach to music. So you can get a whole lot out of studying acoustics and psychoacoustics, music cognition, psychology of music. There are these avenues that are open to us too. So right, I don't want to kind of overwhelm you with all this data, but yeah, that's all these different ideas to work with.
No, I love it. And it's a great reminder that as soon as you think you've hit a wall in music, there's so many other directions to go, and it's never ending, and you'll never learn all of it.
Yeah, it's true. It's true.
It's awesome.
It's kind of odd actually, because music, I mean, if we compare music to language, there's 26 letters in the English alphabet. In music, it's really 12, and we really don't use them all at the same time. So it's simpler in a way, but it ends up being really, really complex.
So let's go back to practicing a little bit. One of the things you brought up is your sense of rhythm and how you work on rhythm, which is one of the things I think that is really interesting, especially as a solo bass player. Your rhythm is incredibly engaging, and I think it's really one of the things that separates you from a lot of other bass players is it's just how your rhythm is just so on point. What are things that musicians can do to improve their rhythm?
I mean, your questions are so great. I mean, I wish more people would ask that question, because that's usually the one we're bad at. And it's certainly true for me. I mean, I've really struggled so much with rhythm.
That's wild to hear you say that, by the way.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's really tough. Uh, I have gotten better over the years, thank God, because I've really, I've really worked so hard on it. But it is a really tough one, and it's one that doesn't tend to get taught that much. You can go to music school and get a degree in music and only have maybe a few classes in rhythm. Everything else is teaching you about harmony. And I have this terrible fear that that's because it's a lot easier to teach harmony than it is to teach rhythm. With harmony, there are recognizable structures, and you can talk about how they move and how you can analyze them and how they tendencies between them, and then how you can extend them, things like that. With rhythm, it's a little harder to, really get studious about it, which is a shame because most of us really have to do that. There's maybe a handful of people that, just are born rhythmic and that's it, but very few. For instance, Zakir Hussain, who you mentioned, might be the most advanced rhythmic human on the planet, as far as I can tell. Just works endlessly on it, just constantly on it. It's kind of amazing. You wonder after a while what else there could be left for him to do, but he is working on it. So it is something we need to work on. There's a few things I could say about it. This is one of the reasons it's nice to study Indian music, is they have a method for studying rhythm, particularly in South Indian music and Carnatic music. And that's, really quite effective and useful. And really kind of one of the few really effective rhythmic methods there are. In the West, we kind of were anti-rhythmic in kind of the classical era. They actually tried not to be rhythmic. It's kind of an interesting thing to do. We could talk about that if you like. So we have a little bit of a disadvantage of that in that way. But yeah, it's a matter of studying the. I'll share what I guess is supposed to be a secret of some kind. I don't know why, but rhythm is really kind of mostly about two things. It's mostly about accuracy and phrasing. So mostly what makes us like a rhythm is that it's accurate and it's phrased well. That's about an 80% rule. The rhythms we like that aren't accurate, but most of the ones we like are accurate. Now, accuracy is a complex concept because accurate to what is the question. And there's a lot of rhythms that may at first not sound accurate, but are actually accurate to a really interesting grid that they're locked to. But just an accurate rhythm isn't enough. It has to be phrased well. It has to tell a story of some kind. So if we just hear, like a electronic sound of just make a snare drum playing eighth notes, electronic sample playing eighth notes, is nothing's more obnoxious than that. But as soon as you add some phrasing to it, make some of the notes louder and quieter and different tones in there as well, then it gets a lot more interesting. So that's really kind of the thing with rhythm. That's what you're trying to do. So for most of us, it's, mostly about playing accurately. And it's really hard to do because our cognitive abilities are really, really finely tuned rhythmically. There's a famous little test you can do it online if you like, that shows you how much more accurate your hearing is in terms of timing than your eyesight. We normally think of our eyesight being our most powerful sense, but in this way, our hearing is really much better. It's like something like 10 times better, where they're like flash two images and you have to tell, when they're in sync. And then you hear two sounds. And with sounds, it's milliseconds apart that we can hear the difference. Something like 10 milliseconds, someplace in there, we can hear the difference. And with seeing images, it's, it's like 10 times more than that what we need. And yourself from, if you work with a delay line, once you get to about 10 milliseconds, you still start to hear the difference in the sound. And that's really a tiny little bit of difference. To control your body to work within the tiny little millisecond framework is very difficult to do. Really, really, really hard to do, and it matters. So if you just played a note 10 milliseconds too late, that's going to have an impact on the music you played. Now that may be the one thing you wanted to do. It may sound good, but most of the time it's not going to do that. So the bulk of working on rhythm is just trying to work on the accuracy. That's a bulk of it. Yeah, I mean, you always want to have time to use whatever ideas you're working with expressively. But it's that push and pull of working on the really boring stuff and then trying to use it in a creative way.
Yeah, it's wild how important rhythm is, and I agree with you 100%. Like, I went to music school, and we didn't really talk about rhythm that much. It was just like, these are eighth notes, these are 16th notes, these are triplets. Figure it out, and
Yeah.
and here's
Yeah.
a swing rhythm for you jazz guys, and
Right.
so yeah, it's a really good point. I never thought about that, so you just pointed that out. Like, we don't talk about rhythm at all.
And it's funny because it matters so much, because everybody can hear this. Then we're not aware we hear it. This is the way music works. Is we're all born insanely musical, but we're just not aware of how musical we are. And if you play something that's rhythmically really cool, so in general, really accurate and phrased really well, you can kind of put any notes on that, and people will like it. As opposed to the other way around, where you have, the notes are exactly what they're supposed to be, but the rhythm is, maybe not all there. Anybody will notice that. You don't have to have any musical training at all to know, that doesn't really sound quite right. It's funny how that is, but we tend to kind of gloss over the rhythmic part of it. And I would say that of the musicians I know, the rhythm is kind of the big secret. The guys that are great with rhythm are always working. Everybody wants to play with them. How much they know of the other stuff is, whatever it is. But, if your rhythm is really awesome, everybody wants to work with you.
Yeah, that's definitely one of the reasons I pick my musicians. The ones that are rhythmic
Yeah.
there's the ones that work for sure.
It makes it a lot easier, doesn't it?
Definitely. All right. So last question about practicing. I'm gonna floor you again with this one here. Um, as far as your practicing goes, what has been the biggest waste of time in your practicing, and what has been of the most benefit to you in practicing?
Oh, yeah. These are good questions. So I mentioned earlier that I always spend time with this kind of body mechanics stuff. So thinking about, with my instrument, it's thinking about the left hand and the right hand, trying to be the most efficient, the most healthy, the most effective as I can be. So I've spent a lot of time doing just the simplest thing you can think of. So, like, maybe put on the metronome and try to play the E string on whole notes for every 4 beats, but try to do it with the most effective body mechanics, the best sound, try to keep the dynamic exactly right, that kind of thing. Whatever super simple thing you can think of. And I think I spent too much time on that. I think I spent too much time doing that kind of stuff and not enough time on tonal material. Because as I mentioned, the tonal material is really the trickiest stuff to master. And the most effective, the Indian rhythm stuff has been helpful for me. Just because, it is really hard to find ways to study rhythm. And this Indian system is good. The thing, it's usually called Carnegie, and it's a system you can study. And then again, there's amazing resources online. You can see some of the guys that were the best at it in the world who will blow your mind with what they can do and what they can think rhythmically. You would just think, nobody could conceive of this rhythm, and these guys can just, they can conceive it, not only conceive it, but perform it perfectly as far as I can tell. But it's also good just for understanding how rhythm works and kind of getting rhythms in your body and getting that kind of thing to be second nature. But as to whether that's been the most helpful, kind of hard to say. One thing that's super helpful for me is recording. That's been really helpful. There's my thinking is this, that music is such a complex activity that we know this, that it's actually using your whole brain when you play music. It's the most brain intensive activity we're aware of. Actually, this has been measured pretty effectively. In fact, my understanding is that if you take dead people and look at their brains, you can actually tell if that was a musician. You can't tell if they were an athlete or a mathematician or anything else, but you can actually look at a person's brain and know if they were a musician. That's my understanding. It's a really, really powerful brain activity. So because of that, I'm pretty sure that there's a lot of overlap in the parts of your brain you're using. So when you're playing music, you have to use some of your speech centers and I think even some of your visual centers when you're playing music, because you're kind of using the whole thing. And I think because of that, it's really hard to hear yourself really well when you're playing. And so recording is so valuable in that, because you can play something and then sit back and listen, and you hear it better when you play it back. And so that's been really powerful for me, because it's always good to assume the tape doesn't lie, as we say. But yeah, I guess those things would have been the most helpful. There's a lot of other things as well, but those are good.
All right, so we're going to take a big left turn here. We're going to come back to the Western world a little bit. So you collaborate with a diverse array of musicians. From your Windham Hill stuff, you've played with, Suzanne Ciani. You've played with crazy avant-garde guitar player Henry Kaiser. I mean, there's different groups you've played with. How do you approach collaborations with artists? And then how do you pick your collaborations?
Right. The second question is a little easier. Pretty much anybody who wants to collaborate. I'm kind of interested in working with people, especially if I, like their music. Then I'm really interested in working with them and learning how they think. The process is really interesting, and again, the question is going to be more interesting than the answer, because it's, you ask the question, how am I going to work with this person? For every project I do, and it doesn't matter, it's often within the same genre. So if I do 2 singer-songwriter records in a week, I still have to sit down and think, okay, how am I going to function within this person's artistic vision, and how can I best support what they're trying to do here? And it could be 2 different processes. It could be, like really remarkably different points of view that really seem to make sense. But yeah, it's trying to figure out what that person wants to say. Often it's asking them about, what they think about music. If you know somebody, it's a lot easier, because you just know how they are in the world and how that manifests in their music. And then just trying to figure it out. I've certainly made so many mistakes, and I feel so bad for some of the things I've done with people's music where, I thought, oh yeah, this would be cool. And there's just, that's not cool. But yeah, hopefully I've gotten it right a couple times and helped people to express what they want to express. But it's, it can be remarkably different from project to project. For one project, it may be all about the lyrics. It's all about whatever the message is in the lyrics. For the next project, it may be all about the colors of the sound, the timbres of the sound. And, maybe there's not a lot going on tonally. It's just about getting interesting timbres. The next project, it may be all about energy. They just really want it to have an impactful energy. The next project, it, maybe about healing. They want to heal people with their music. And so it's all about that. And so it's just a matter of trying to figure out if I can bring something valuable to the table.
I love it. I think that's the way it should be. You serve the music, right?
Hopefully. I mean, it's a privilege to have the opportunity to do that. I mean, it's always a privilege when somebody says, "Hey, I want you to help me make my musical vision come true." And so hopefully we can serve the music well together. That's the goal.
Now, a lot of you might know Rhinestone just for our podcast, and that's awesome. We love our podcast. They're doing really well. But one thing that Rhinestone also does is we have a virtual music studio where we help artists take their songs from bedroom demos to completed master works. And we help them out by having our team of 25 musicians, engineers, and producers who help craft perfect songs. We take songs that literally can be recorded on an iPad. We had one artist record it on an iPad and then turn it into an incredible song with the help of strings, horns, real drums, great bass playing, and all sorts of other stuff. And so a lot of people, they have day jobs. They have, we work with doctors, we work with lawyers who maybe they don't have enough time to go have band practice, but they have enough time to put a song together. And maybe they don't have time to arrange recording sessions and check out all this stuff. And Rhinestone takes care of a lot of that. We help artists all the time save time and get high quality musicians with every turn. And what our virtual studio has been able to do has been phenomenal. We've helped artists land Spotify placements. We've done TV show theme songs. We've done all sorts of different things, and all from the comfort of home for a lot of artists where maybe they don't have the opportunity or the connections to really take it further. So if this sounds like something you'd be interested in, I would love for you guys to email me the word virtual studio at rhinestonemusic@gmail.com. That is RHYNESTONE music@gmail.com. And we will hook you up with a special deal that is exclusive for our podcast listeners. And that I would love to get to know and see what we can do to help your music get to that next level. So you famously studied with Jaco Pastorius. Now, for those of our listeners who don't know Jaco, you should turn this podcast off and go listen to his debut record, because it's probably one of the best fusion records of all time. But you got to study with him, and I'm curious, what kind of things did you learn in lessons with him?
Yeah, he was a really complicated guy. He was bipolar, so he was pretty ill, and he was full of contradictions, absolutely full of contradictions. He knew a lot about music, but often liked to play as if he didn't, which is kind of odd. When I was studying with him in New York in the early 80s, he had a dream to start a bass school. He really wanted to have a bass school and really wanted to have a way of teaching electric bass in this really advanced, really creative way. But in spite of that, he had no real method or curriculum or anything like that, which is kind of funny. And it could be he taught a fair amount in those days, and it could be really off-putting to a lot of people. A lot of people went to him for lessons, and he would just stare at them, and they were really freaked out by that. I kind of got the vibe right from the bat and said, okay, well, I have about 1 million questions I'd like to ask you. And he was always super sweet, and he liked that. He liked it, that I had plenty of stuff for us to work on. And he would always answer my questions very, very kindly. And so it was mostly directed, I directed kind of where I wanted to go. When I studied with him, I already understood his music pretty well on a technical level, but I really was struggling to understand, like, the connection between how he was making the music and I guess that's it. I understood, the chords and the notes, but it was really hard to understand how that was coming out of a human being. And so I asked him a lot of questions about his fingerings for things and his phrasing for things. And some extent, a little bit about harmony, whether he was thinking of this as a augmented chord or whether he was thinking of it more as an altered chord, things like that. But it was, mostly kind of the hands-on, how did you do this? And yeah, and he was always very nice about it. Often it would be something where I would say, like, I would have a piece of his that he played, I would play it for him, and I would say, am I doing this right? And often I wouldn't have it right. He'd have fingered it in some really bizarre way that wouldn't have occurred to me. And he'd show me that, and I'd try to play it and say, well, it doesn't sound like when you played it. And he'd often say, no, it sounds fine. And I'd say, oh, well, okay, let's talk about something else then. So that's kind of the way it went. Yeah, he liked to play a lot together. So we would sit and play jazz standards a lot together. And he was pretty good at instructing through that method, where I would, be playing through a standard and, not really making a certain set of harmony all that clear. And then he would play and then he would solo in a way that made it clear. And I go, right. That's what I need to do. Um, but yeah, that was kind of how it went. I mostly had to kind of direct a lot of the instruction myself, but that was fine. It's totally fine.
Do you remember what songs you played to him of his?
Yes, I remember playing. There's a solo he played on an Ian Hunter record. It was right around the time he did his first record, so early or around 1977. The record's called All American Alien Boy, I think, and that's the title track. And he played a bass solo on this pop tune, and it's so amazing. It's just like wow, kind of hard to describe. It's not like super chopsy, but it's just really the melodic ideas are just really clever. And I played it for him and asked it if I was phrasing it correctly, and he corrected me on some of that phrasing. And I tried to get from him, how he came up with that, and he was a little bit helpful with that. He said that some of that came from Frank Sinatra. Um, there's a phrase he used to play all the time that actually is a standard bluegrass lick. Boom, ba bum ba. It's a standard thing you do on the banjo. It's in bluegrass. It's a way that you kind of announce the end of a phrase. Often, like if you're soloing, that will be the last thing you'll play to announce that you're done with your soloing. And he loved that lick and put it in everywhere. But often he would have displaced it rhythmically or done it in different, changed a few notes in it. But yeah, that's where he got it from. It's very common to hear that kind of music in Florida. That's where he got it. Some of the other things were he learned a lot from this pianist he played with, Alex Darkey. He used to play with him a lot and learned a lot of this kind of country stuff. But the way he would play it was really different. So yeah, that was interesting.
I thought you were going to
And
say like
yeah,
Teen Town or something, like you played Teen Town right to his face or something like that.
I did. I did play
No,
Teen
did you?
Town to make sure that I had it right, and I didn't have some of the notes right,
Oh my
which he
God.
corrected me on. Uh, and that was one where I played it and I said, it just doesn't sound right. And he said, no, that's perfect. That's exactly how it should sound. And I said, no, it isn't. It doesn't sound good at all. How can I play it like you? And he kept saying, don't worry about playing like me. Just the way you're playing is perfect. Just play it that way. And I said, yeah, I don't want to play it that way. That was actually kind of helpful because it made me realize that, you know, that I'm not Jaco. I'm never going to play it like Jaco, and neither should I. If I could play it exactly like him, the best that would be a, pale recreation as opposed to, playing it like myself, which might actually be something interesting. So that it was helpful. He said things like that a lot where, it's okay to imitate me, but, at some point you just have to not worry about it and just do what you're going to do. And that's fine. That's actually a good thing. that was hard for me to understand. He had to keep saying that over and over, actually, because that was hard for me to understand in those days. That it wasn't just about imitating him as closely as I possibly could.
That is so wild. I can't imagine playing Teen Town in front of Jaco. That's like playing Little Wing in front of Hendrix. It's just like, God, that would be such a. I'd be the balls you have, man, to pull that
Well,
off.
it was really nerve wracking, and I was completely terrified because I worshipped the guy. My whole world revolved around him, and I played it horribly. But I wanted to know if I was playing it right. That was the most important thing. To try to play it right. It is a really interesting melody. It's really put together in this really interesting way. The way it works. It's basically thinking like bebop, and he was really good at doing those kinds of things. But that part of it I understood, so we didn't really have to go over that as much as just the mechanics of trying to play it and make it sound good. That was the hard part for me. Still is the hard part for me.
So the other thing I was going to bring up is that Jaco is probably known for having probably the most famous solo bass composition, which is Portrait of Tracy. Um, did you guys ever show each other any solo bass work you were doing? Because you told me you've been composing solo bass pretty much from the get go. Did you ever show him any of your solo bass work or anything like that?
I did show him one piece that I was working on a little bit, and he was very supportive and said, "You need to, just keep doing that." Um, but it wasn't. Everything I played for him was pretty horrible, so I wouldn't have expected much more from him than that. And I did play some A Portrait of Tracy for him to see if I got it right. He never really played the whole piece. I think he had forgotten a lot of it. Um, I've never been able to play it very well because there's a point at which where you have to have this really big stretch. He plays an E flat harmonic or D sharp harmonic, more technically correct. And you have to, in order to do it, you have to have this big stretch. And I just could never do it. And he kept telling me I could. I can't do it. I just can't. He kept saying, "No, you've got it. And I still can't play it. So I never was very good at playing that for him. But he wasn't really that interested in that kind of thing so much. Yeah. Uh, he was certainly supportive. I think part of it was, he had broken up with Tracy at that point and had a lot of emotions about playing the piece. He always would quote from it, play the first part of it. But I don't think I ever heard him play the whole thing live. I'm not sure. In fact, I don't know if there's a recording of him playing the whole piece live.
I don't believe there is.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think he wrote other
That's
stuff and he
strange.
started playing with like loopers and stuff for his
Yeah.
solos and stuff.
Yeah.
It's just wild.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's keep talking about solo bass here. Obviously, if someone were to talk about you, they're gonna say, "Oh, Michael Manring, the solo bass guy," right? And that's awesome. I mean, you are, I think, the premier guy for solo bass. Um, and what I'm really curious about is how do you keep a solo bass show interesting? And how do you structure a set list? Because it seems like one of those things that could become very boring very quickly. But yet I've watched countless YouTube videos of you. It never seems boring. And it seems like you always have enough directions to go to keep the show an experience that the audience wants to see. How do you do that?
Oh, thank you. Wow. Ever since I was a kid, I always wanted to play solo shows. I always wanted to play, at least just to play solo bass pieces. And people always told me, no one wants to hear that. In fact, people told me that my whole life. I think maybe they finally stopped. But basically, when I got a record deal, I told people I wanted to make a solo record, and they said, "Yeah, that's great, but no one wants to hear that." And it's just what I heard over and over again. And so it always seemed strange to me because I love to hear the bass, and hearing it solo is especially thrilling to me because you hear all of its subtleties and all this different kind of color that's in the instrument. So I never really understood why that was the case, but I took it seriously because everybody said it. Everybody said, that's just going to bore everybody to tears, just playing bass solo. And so I thought, okay, well, if I'm going to do this, I have to do whatever I can to make it interesting. I mean, I'm going to do what I want to do, but I'm going to try to do as much as I can stand to make this, bearable for people, because I just have to assume that they're going to be really uncomfortable listening to this, to me playing. And so I've tried to do things that I thought, it, it, that I thought were relatively entertaining. I mean, I'm not an entertainer. I'll never be an entertainer. That's just not who I am. But I try to kind of focus on things that I thought people might want to hear. Yeah, I mean, it's always got to be something I want to play. But, um, I enjoyed doing something that I think people might want to hear. One of the things I've always tried to do some cover tunes in my sets, because a lot of the stuff I play is very composery and very kind of weird and using a lot of bizarre techniques. And so I kind of assume that people are there going, yeah, I don't know what this is. I don't know what's going on. So if I can play something they recognize, they can go, oh, okay, I get it. So this is something I know. And I enjoy that. I enjoy being able to communicate with people. Otherwise, I just do this stuff on my own, which would be totally fine as well. So it's things like that. And if I've come across a technique that I think is fun to see, then I'll kind of explore that and maybe take that out live as well, so that, there's something something remarkable in some way for people to enjoy. Because I like playing for people, and I figure if I'm going to do it, I do want to. It's not my goal to alienate the audience. For some people, it is. They like alienating audiences. I I don't particularly want to do that. I would love it if they could go away saying, "Oh yeah, so maybe bass is cool, and maybe I'll go to another solo bass concert sometime." That would be awesome. And so if there's something I can do that makes it entertaining for them, I'll usually do it.
How do you choose cover tunes for your set list?
It's always got to be something I like, something that falls on the bass in some interesting way, and something that I really like playing tunes that that has something to say. So, yeah, sometimes I play Teen Town in my shows in a few different ways. I used to do it with the loopers, and I often do it just playing it without loopers, because that kind of says something. It pays respect to Jaco, who I admired so much. Sometimes there'll be a piece of pop music that has a kind of certain thing that it says that I like.
Like, give me an example of a pop song, because that's such a vague term.
It is. I apologize for that. And generally, I seem to play older pop music than new pop music. I don't often listen to that much pop music just because I'm busy doing other things. So it's kind of the older stuff. Well, I started playing. Sometimes I found myself playing the Bob Dylan tune "Times They Are Changing," because there's a line in it about, um, you better start swimming or you'll sink like a stone. Because the times they are changing. And in fact, that's actually what's happening with climate change. The waters are, in fact, rising. It's kind of interesting to me. And it's a beautiful piece of music. So things like that, that kind of have a. Sometimes I play "Born to Be Wild" just because it's funny. I think, and I just loved the tune when I was 12 years old.
Yeah.
Just totally. That was heavy metal in those days. I was all about that. So it's fun to do things like that.
All right. So one last question before we go to our rapid fire section. Do you have any regrets as a musician?
Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah, I guess. Yeah. I'm sure I have regrets. Big ones, I can't think of any huge ones. There's questions I would have liked to ask of people who are no longer with us. But I guess most of the regrets are small. Things like, I do kind of regret I didn't. I spent so much time working on this kind of mechanical aspects of playing, and I probably should have been working on other things a little bit more, and a little less of that. But yeah, nothing huge that I can think of.
Is there anything you would have done differently in your career?
Oh yeah, oh yeah, a lot of things. I mean, it would have been nice to know what was going to be popular. I've just never had any sense of what people were going to like and what they weren't going to like. And it would have been nice to have done stuff that was going to be popular more early on, because I would have been able to make some more money from it. But I've been so lucky to make the money I have in music. That's a silly thing. But yeah, no, I would do things a lot differently, if for no other reason, just to see what would happen if I did things differently.
I love it. All right. So that concludes the first part of our interview here. And we're going to do a little rapid fire question where we ask you some questions. Just give us the first thing that comes to your mind. Sound good, Michael?
This is good. Yeah, this will be good for me, because as you can tell, I tend to be way too long-winded. So I'll be as terse as I can.
Well, if you want to be long-winded on these too, we're time is on your side here. What is the last album that blew your mind?
The Tigran Hamasyan record, Red Hail.
Okay. And what about that record caught your attention?
It's amazing, really complex, but also really beautiful. A really amazing blend of Armenian music and jazz and fusion, and everybody on it just plays beautifully. Compositions are beautiful. The playing's beautiful. Just a wonderful, wonderful voice in music.
Any tracks in particular that stand out?
No, the whole record's amazing.
Okay. Who is an artist that deserves more attention?
Kaushiki Chakrabarti.
All right. Who is that?
She's a Hindustani singer, just so beautiful, so amazing. There's so many Indian musicians that deserve a lot more attention, but she's the first one that comes to mind.
Okay, I might need to hit you up on the spelling for that one later. I'm in the
Okay.
emails afterwards.
All right.
We'll see if we can include a link to something she's done. If you lost all of your gear in a tragic house fire and had to start over with only $1,000, what would you get?
Wow. Okay, $1,000. I would take that $1,000 and I'd give it to Joe Zahn and say, whatever you can do for me, please do. Joe Zahn is the guy that has built my instruments for many, many years.
How do you recover from a gig that's going terribly?
In the moment or afterward?
In the moment.
In the moment. I remind myself, what a privilege it is to play music, and I try to focus on doing the best I can in the circumstance.
Who is a bassist you look up to?
Jules Zafimahri. Another one that's really hard to spell.
What about them attracts you to their playing?
So he lives in Madagascar and plays this music there called salagi. And this is not an old form of music, relatively new. So Madagascar is an large island nation off the coast of East Africa. And so they have this really interesting set of influences there. So the music is very pleasant to hear and rhythmically really interesting. The salagi form of music is a 6/8 with the accent on 2 and 5. So you hear but, and you think, oh, that's 1 and 4. It's actually 2 and 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And so they got a hold of electric basses there some years ago, and I don't think they had any recordings of electric bass. And so they just took the instrument and played it like, they would their other instruments. And there's a very small tradition of solo bass playing on the island of Madagascar. Just beautiful, but really kind of interesting 6/8 rhythm that they do with it. And just really wonderful. There's a guy named Toti who kind of got the ball rolling. And there's a couple of other people that have been doing things since then. And Jules Maori is one of those guys that's really just plays bass in this really lovely, kind of complex way, but kind of hard to describe. And it really sounds nothing like any other bass you ever heard.
Oh, I'm excited. I definitely will hit you up for the spelling on that one too.
Okay.
Okay. And then the last question, what do people get wrong about being a musician?
I guess let me think just for a minute about that. Oh, yeah. A couple of things come to mind. I guess what I would have to say is how deep music is, that people don't realize, how much is really going on in music. I guess I'll say that.
Well, I definitely think this podcast proved that, Michael. This was so much fun. I learned so much. This was incredible. This was just such a fun interview, and I want to say thank you so much for coming on. Michael, the floor is yours. Any projects you want to promote, any projects that you're involved in, tours, whatever, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you so much, Banner. So I'm doing stuff all the time, and if people want to sign up to my social media or check my website, those are always good. I'm always, announcing the playing I'm doing, the performances I'm doing, and the recordings I'm working on there. My last solo recording is called Small Moments. It's available on Bandcamp, which is really the best place to for us musicians. If you want to listen to our music, you can buy it there, or you can just listen to it there. That would be lovely if people would support all of us on Bandcamp.
Well, hey, thank you so much, Michael, for coming on the podcast. I can't wait till we can do it again sometime.
The pleasure's been mine, Banner. Thank you for your amazing questions. And I apologize. My answers were not as good as the questions.
No, you were more than great. I appreciate it. Oh my gosh, guys. What an interview. Michael blew my mind at least 10 times in this podcast. I mean, just, gosh, can you even go over all the stuff he went? I mean, it's just unbelievable. I need to I want to have him back on again. We already talked about this. He is going to come back on again because there's still so much other stuff we want to dive into and get into. And I don't even feel like 2 hours was enough. And we ended afterwards. We were like, oh man, that was 2 hours. I can't believe that was 2 hours. And it was just so much fun. Michael's the dude. I mean, I can't tell you how much I enjoyed this podcast. I could go on and on. I learned so much cool stuff. Yeah, so anyway, our intro and outro music as always is Target Rockstar by Maddie Music Madness. My name is Banner Driscoll. You can find me anywhere on social media at Banner Driscoll Media, at anywhere. That's right. If you have any questions, concerns, comments, anything about the podcast, feel free to hit me up at rhinestonemusic@gmail.com. That's RHYNESTONE music@gmail.com. Please subscribe. Please comment, like anything you like down below. Engagement's important. We're trying to get to 1,000 subscribers, y'all. I want to make money. And until next time, thank you for listening.